If you're a contractor who's walked a big multifamily roof and thought, man, this is a real project, you're probably right. But here's what most people don't realize, that until they're inside of that world, that in multifamily, the roof often isn't discussed as a roofing problem. It's discussed as a net operating income problem. That one shift can really change how owners listen and how decisions get made, and why some contractors can do everything right and still feel like they can't get traction. This is not about being better than anyone else. It's not about being cheaper or louder or more polished. It's about understanding the scoreboard that the ownership side is watching and learning how to connect your work to that scoreboard in a way that makes sense in the boardroom. The decisions are made. Most contractors I know, they take pride in their work, clean work. They care about the details. They care about what they're doing, right? They're trying to build something stable. They're not just trying to chase jobs. And if that sounds like you, then multifamily might be one of the most durable growth lanes available to you. Not because it's easy, not because it's some magical market. It's because it's durable. It runs on systems, and systems reward consistency. Here's the thing that I think is the one part that matters the most, is that a roof in multifamily is not just only a building component. I look at it as a financial instrument. It influences performance, it influences risk, it influences the stability part of the operating plan. That also means that when an ownership group looks at a roof decision, they're not only asking, what does it cost? They're asking, what does it do to the asset? And if you've ever felt like that you're speaking clearly and still not being heard, it probably isn't being personal to you guys. It's not about your workmanship. It might not even be about your reputation. It could be the language gap between the field conversation and the boardroom conversation that they're having behind closed doors. And I think the mindset is real simple. You're not selling a roof. You're protecting the income. I know that sentence can sound like business talk, but I want to put it as plain as I can and put it into reality. In multifamily, income is rent collected and units occupied. It's all about the renewals. It's about the reputation. It's about the momentum generated from leasing. It's also about really the absence of chaos, because chaos shows up, as like after hours leaks. It shows up as interior damage. It shows up, as maintenance labor begins to spike, as tenants begin to complain, and God forbid if there's insurance claims. And when a roof fails, the impact doesn't just stay on the roof. It spreads into the operations. It spreads into the experience that the resident and the tenants are having. It spreads into the expenses. And all of that flows into the net operating income. And if you want to grow in multifamily, you don't need to become a different person. You don't need to turn into this slick sales guy. You don't need to become bilingual overnight. You just keep your technical integrity, and you just learn how to translate that integrity into the outcomes that the ownership groups actually measure. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as I can, the NOI, without really getting super academic. NOI is net operating income. It's what properties produce after operating expenses, before debt and taxes. The reason it matters is because most of this is the central measuring system that they use to understand how an asset is performing. A lot of ownership groups, they live inside of that number, what the NOI is. They manage that number relentlessly, and they watch it during budgeting. They watch it during renewals. They watch it when they're updating their insurance and having those insurance conversations. They watch it when they're getting ready to refinance. They watch it when they decide whether to sell that building or not. So when you bring a roof conversation to them, you could talk about memory, you could talk about flashing, you could talk about drains, penetrations, and warranty, NDLs, all those things. Those are all real things. Those things matter. But at the portfolio level, where the decision makers are, they're also tracking what does the roof do to their predictable operating expense and operation of stability. there's a structural advantage that most contractors have, and some of them haven't fully considered it. And if your work can reduce operating expenses and that variance, right? If it can reduce risky events, if it can preserve asset performance, then your work becomes part of the plan for their operations. And once you become part of the plan, you're no longer evaluated the same way as somebody who's just doing a one off bid. There's really, I think, two worlds in contracting, and I don't think either one of them is wrong. There's the transactional work where a property has a problem, a bid gets requested, numbers get compared, and a job gets awarded. That model keeps a lot of companies healthy. It's also built a lot of really good businesses out there. Then there's the portfolio-based work where a group of owners multiply properties and then they try to run those assets through consistency. They're really in like a pattern of thinking that it's thinking to them about risk. It's thinking to them about how one vendor performs across not just one location, but maybe 5 or 20 or 80 different communities. But in the transactional world, a contractor can win by just being strong on their scope of work and their price and then executing world. But in the portfolio world, the questions change. They still really care about the quality. They care about the scope. They care about the money, but they also care about whether the vendor reduces friction inside of that system. It's not about ego. It's not about status. It's just the reality that these portfolios run on with that cadence, with the documentation, with the communication, with the repeatable standards. And in multifamily, the roof isn't just a line item. It's a lever that moves the building stability. That's why, a simple leak event can really become a bigger conversation than contractor expects, because a leak can trigger interior damage. It can trigger displaced tenants. It can trigger, maintenance that needs to be sent out in overtime in emergency calls. It can trigger a claim through insurance. It can trigger negative reviews from the residents within the community. It can trigger frictions within the leases because maybe that resident's no longer going to renew and going to move out. None of that is theoretical. It's the daily reality inside of the communities that hundreds of these residents are living in. And when you understand that part of it, the roof stops being a project and starts being a performance driver. And when you talk that way, when you stop sounding like a vendor and you start sounding like somebody who understands the asset, that a well-maintained roof can influence the NOI in predictable ways, and you don't need to be a finance person to really see this and understand it, it's going to reduce unplanned expenses because the emergency calls are going to cost way more than planned work. It reduces disruption because tenants of not renewing when they feel like they're ignored or they're constantly being impacted. It reduces risk because claims and anything like this, those events, they have a long tail. It also supports capital planning because the ownership group, they want to know what the replacement time is and they want to plan for that strategically. And when a roof system is maintained, the ownership gets to plan instead of reacting. Right? The planning actually helps stabilize the budget. Planning helps reduce surprises. Planning reduces the number of fires that a property manager has to put out. This is where contractors can unintentionally miss the mark. A contractor might deliver a strong technical recommendation, but that recommendation lands flat because it's not tied to the owner's outcome. It's tied to protect, right? Your scope isn't just the story. The story is what your scope does to the property's performance. And that's a different way to present that same truth. It's not that you got to spin it. It's just the translation. So if we say, hey, we recommend repairs on these flashing transitions and we recommend addressing these drains, right? That is accurate. It's also incomplete for where the boardroom is, where they're making decisions. The boardroom wants to know what happens if they do it and what happens if they don't. So if you say, hey, we're recommending these repairs to reduce any sort of leak events during storms and limiting the interior damage or exposure, right? And then we can stabilize this through maintenance plans that is going to allow us to create a window for you to plan for the replacement strategically, you didn't change the work, you just changed the relevance of the work. And I think in multifamily, relevance is a form of respect. It tells the ownership side that you understand what they're responsible for. I think property managers and ownership groups, they're not optimizing for the same thing, even though that they work together. A property manager is living day to day. They're trying to keep the residents stable. They're trying to reduce complaints. They're trying to keep vendors accountable. They're trying to prevent emergencies. They're trying to keep up from their teams getting buried. But ownership groups, they're looking at the asset level. They're looking at the portfolio level. They're looking at the stability that can come through the NOI. They're looking to stabilize that. They're looking at the risk management. They're looking at planned capital expenses. They're looking at the exposure to insurance. They're looking at the performance consistency across multiple sites. And a contractor can be excellent and still struggle to enter multifamily if they only present themselves as a project vendor. It's not an insult. It's just a mismatch of framing that needs to be adjusted. The advantage is that not in multifamily, it doesn't necessarily pay more. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But the advantage is that once you earn a place inside of a portfolio's operating rhythm, that relationship begins to change shape. In transactional markets, you complete a job by job. In portfolio markets, you're being evaluated account by account. That doesn't mean that you stop bidding. It just means that you stop living and dying by single events because you're not really just predicated on that one event. You're building trust inside of a system that values repeatability. And systems prefer consistency. Systems, inside of those portfolios are huge. And if you can reduce friction and you can reduce surprises and you can provide predictable documentation, you become valuable in a way that price alone can't replace. It's not about being premium, it's about being operationally useful. Multifamily is not necessarily harder work, it's just more managed work. The expectations go beyond the installation quality. They extend into the communication, they extend into the documentation, they extend into the discipline that you have of closing out a project. They extend into how you coordinate around the residents and the community. They extend into how you report your progress, how you extend into how you respond when there is an issue, when something's leaking, because something's always going to leak somewhere. And if you're used to just winning jobs on craftsmanship alone and doing that work really well, it's a super strong foundation. Multifamily just asks you to package that foundation in a way that aligns with how portfolios operate. And when contractors say, hey, we're great at roofing, but we can't break into multifamily, sometimes the missing piece isn't the production. Sometimes it's just tweaking the operating interface. It's how you show up inside of that boardroom by translating, not with some fancy words, but just being able to connect the roof conversation to the financial and operational outcomes. It means that you get to keep your integrity, keep your standards, then frame the recommendations around the realities that the owner is managing. It also means that you get to ask different questions. You don't need a new personality. You just possibly need better questions that invite strategy instead of only scope of work. And if you ask how long they plan to hold an asset, or if you're aligning the roof plan with their timeline, if you ask what their biggest leak related cross driver was across the entire portfolio, you're looking for patterns, not just symptoms. And if you ask predictability, what would that be worth within their operation? You're positioning the roof as being the guy that can help stabilize that. Those questions are not sales tricks. They're strategy questions. And multifamily responds to strategy because multifamily is managed through strategy. I want to see if you can pick up on this shift. And I want this to try to sit with you. In transactional work, the goal is often to win the job, but in portfolio work, at least to me, the goal is to earn a place in the plan. And when you aim for a place in the plan, you change how you present, you change what you deliver, you change what you document, you change how you communicate, you change what you do after the job is done because the relationship continues into the next decisions always coming. Right? So a well-maintained roof signals way more than just waterproofing. It signals operational discipline. It signals reduced variance. It signals fewer escalations that are going to happen. It signals cleaner reporting. It signals predictable life cycle planning that you know how to do that. And that's comfort in the boardroom. And when the boardroom has comfort, it has value. You don't need to become someone else to provide it. You already have it. You just have to become intentional about how you package it, what you already do really well. And if multifamily growth's on your radar, consider this as part of your starting point. The roof isn't just a roof in their world. It's a lever that's tied to the NOI, to the net operating income. It's tied to stability. It's tied to risk. It's tied to predictability. Those boardroom conversations and the contractors who win long-term are the ones who connect the field reality to the outcome within the board without losing integrity. And the next time you walk a roof, try this, experiment on it. Imagine that roof is being discussed in a boardroom tomorrow. Imagine the people who will never climb a ladder are making decisions based on that roof and what it does to their asset. And when you ask yourself, what would they say to the income, to the risk, to the expenses? If you can answer that clearly, you'll start presenting differently. You'll start planning differently. I think you're going to start being heard differently, not because you changed your work, not because you changed who you are, but because you learned how to speak the language that the ownership side is already using to decide what happens next.